On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the Navy's only oiler out in the Middle East has been damaged. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, the sole U.S. Navy oiler, USNS, U.S. naval ship, Bighorn, out in the Middle East. This is one of 14 Kaiser-class oilers operated by the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command. This is an agency that crews vessels for the U.S. Navy. About 1 out of every 5 ships in the Navy have merchant mariners on board. Was involved in either an elision or a grounding that has damaged at least one of the ship's rudders, led to flooding of the after steering compartment. The ship is perfectly safe. It's anchored off the coast of Oman. The compartment has been dewatered. There's no reported oil spill. However, this is the oiler that was providing fuel for the Lincoln Strike Group. Now, while the Abraham Lincoln is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, its planes and its escort vessels require the Bighorn to provide them with fuel and jet fuel for all their operations. We're going to take a look at this incident and, more importantly, put this into context. What does it mean for a carrier strike group out forward deployed to lose its oiler? If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. So USNS Bighorn was showcased by Military Sealift Command just the other day. It was its ship in the spotlight. It is a Kaiser-class oiler. These were originally a class of 18 vessels. The construction began in the mid-1980s. The last vessel was finished in the mid-1990s. Bighorn is a single-hull oiler, can carry 180,000 barrels of fuel, a mix of diesel fuel and jet fuel. These vessels were really the backbone for underway replenishment. They are being phased out by a new class of vessels we'll talk about, the John Lewis class. Of the 18 Kaiser-class oilers that were constructed, 2 of them were never completed. The Benjamin Isherwood and Henry Eckford, ironically named for 2 of the best shipbuilders in the history of the U.S. Navy, were never finished. They had a very checkered career, being built up at Penn Shipbuilding and then down at Tampa. They were basically laid up and scrapped incomplete. Of the 16 vessels, 1 has been transferred to Chile, and another vessel, the deal has been taken out of service, with one of the 14 earmarked to be taken out of service shortly, the John Lenthal, which was actually one of my ships that I sailed on. Here were some of the initial reports that came in. John Conrad over at gCaptain really posted the first substantial story on it. If you read any story, it's going to link you back to gCaptain and John Conrad. This came up on the gCaptain forum, which is a great source for background information. If you don't follow the gCaptain forum, you should really hop over to it. You get some great inside information. You get a lot of mariners who are talking on it, and you get these images like this of that steering compartment being flooded. And then there are a few face group books that are also following this. This is Military Sealift Command 101 with the report that Bighorn initially grounded or struck something underwater with their 15-foot flat being flooded. Again, there were a lot of social media reports on this coming out, and so the information was floating out there late last night, September 23rd, 2024. And then on Instagram, you can also find a video showing some of the flooding that took place on board the vessel. Sam Legrone over USNI News has a more complete story on this. He's referencing John Conrad's story from gCaptain along with some other information. He was able to get some commentary from Central Command, who confirmed the vessel's grounding or elision and the fact that the ship is now anchored off of Oman, not leaking any oil, and we're waiting for a further size up on the situation. So the purpose of this video today is not to highlight the fact that a ship has suffered an accident. You know, MSC has run a series of issues here recently with ship groundings. We had the Woody Williams grounding off of Gabon. We had the USNS Alan Shepard grounding off of Bahrain. Accidents happen. There's no denying that. As long as you're driving a ship, an accident eventually will happen. What I want to highlight here is the issue of how precarious the U.S. Navy's logistics is. This is the sole oiler supporting the Abraham Lincoln Battle Group in the U.S. Fifth Fleet area. The closest oilers to reinforce them is one up in the Mediterranean, the Patuxent, which is supporting the Wasp Battle Group, and then another one here off of Singapore, the Rappahannock. So one of those oilers may have to come in and do reinforcement to replace Bighorn. But the problem is when you have 14 oilers and then 2 supply class fast combat ships, a mix of oiler and dry cargo ammunition ship, when you have 16 ships to support the U.S. Navy, you're going to run those ships pretty hard. To give you the rundown exactly of where ships are, so you've got Bighorn in the Middle East, you've got Patuxent in the Mediterranean, you've got Rappahannock in and around the Singapore area. Well, in the Western Pacific, you have 2 other oilers that are potentially available. You've got 2 oilers on the west coast of the United States in the 3rd Fleet AOR. You've got one that's in the 2nd Fleet AOR in Norfolk, the USNS Grumman, which is probably going to be one of the oilers we see deploy soon. USNS Lenthal, I mentioned earlier, is about to be taken out of service. It's the next one scheduled for phase out. And then you have not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 oilers that are scattered in shipyards around the world. 1 in Singapore, 2 in Alabama, 1 in South Carolina, and 1 up in Portland, Oregon. You don't have a lot of backup in this. And that's a big problem, because if you don't have backup, when you lose a ship like Bighorn, you have got to scramble to fix it. Now, the AOEs, the supply, which just did yeoman service with the Eisenhower Battle Group, it's in a shipyard down in Alabama. The Arctic, which is available, is on the east coast of the United States. She could potentially deploy over, but 2 of their sister ships, Bridge and Rainier, were taken out of service a decade ago, laid up on the west coast. Now, not to worry, we have new oilers coming out. The Kaisers are going to be replaced by this class of vessels being built over in San Diego at NASCO, the John Lewis class. 3 of the vessels are out. John Lewis, the Harvey Milk, and then the Robert F. Kennedy are out. However, the John Lewis, which came into service 2 years ago, has not yet entered full operational service. It hasn't done a deployment yet. It has spent almost more time in shipyard than it has in actually conducting underway replenishment. It is back up in Vigor in Portland for a second post-delivery availability. The Harvey Milk is sitting pierside in Norfolk, but she's about to go into a shipyard period. And they, along with the Robert F. Kennedy, have some issues. The first 3 ships have some substantial issues that need to be corrected. And so we don't have them yet. And what this means is that the ability of the U.S. Navy to deploy and sustain its battle groups is very precarious. So to support U.S. battle groups, whether it's an amphibious group or a strike group, requires vessels that can go from forward bases, fuel up, and bring the fuel, ammunition, dry cargo out to them. Inherently, what we have done basically since World War II was operate 2 types of vessels. One were called station ships. Station ships were the ones that would provide immediate assistance to the battle group. In other words, these are the ones that came alongside and refueled the carriers, the cruisers, the destroyers, the amphibious groups. In the meantime, you would have shuttle ships that would go back to the forward bases, grab the fuel, grab the ammunition, grab the cargo, and meet those station ships out at sea. This allowed you to keep your station ships fully fueled, operating out at sea, while your shuttle ships went back in. Well, that all changed with the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, there was a realignment of missions. Behold the Holy Grail that changed nearly everything. This was a GAO report, General Accounting Office report of 1997, that discussed the turnover of auxiliary ship operations to the military Sealift Command, and that could save millions. Remember, we're talking 1990s, peace dividend. Soviet Union had collapsed. No one saw China on the horizon except for a very few amount of very insightful people. And the idea was it was the end of history. And we can get by with taking Navy crews off these ships, and we would get a cost benefit by putting merchant marine crews on, something we started doing after the Vietnam War with the USNS Teluga, the very first underway replenishment ship transferred to military Sealift Command. The recommendation at the end of the GAO report, given the potential savings that could result if the Navy turned over the operation of the 7 active multi-product auxiliary ships and the 1 ship due for delivery in early 1998 to MSC for crewing with civil service mariners, we recommend that the Secretary of Defense direct the Secretary of the Navy to devise a detailed plan for turning over in a timely manner the operation of the multi-product auxiliary ships to MSC. By multi-product, we mean those station ships. The Navy was manning the station ships, the AOEs, the AORs. These are the ones that carry the oil, the ammunition, the cargo in a mixed group, just like on board USNS Supply. The shuttle ships were ammunition ships, dry cargo ships, and oilers manned by Military Sealift Command. Late 1990s, they sit there and say, you can save millions, I tell you, if you turn this operation over to Military Sealift Command. The other thing it got you was it took Navy crews off these vessels, allowed you to put them onto warships, and because now civilian crews man the vessels, you didn't have to worry about the personnel and operation tempo of the vessels, where rules prevented you from deploying vessels for so many days at sea. Under Navy rules, didn't have those with civilian crews, and so you can run these ships ragged, and the Navy did. It's one of the reasons why we see the crewing problem that is happening and why they're talking about laying up ships, the 17 ships, although I have heard that the Secretary of the Navy has sunk that idea. They're not going to lay up the 17 ships now. But this led to the issues we're seeing right now. Now, the historical analogy here goes back to a video I did on 6 oilers. You can see it up above here. It talks about the 6 fast oilers that were introduced into the Navy early in the Pacific War of 1941 and 1942. And again, history provides you with so many lessons, particularly in the field of logistics. When World War II started, the U.S. Navy had to shift from its emphasis on the battleship to the fast carriers. And the key word there is fast. Fast means fuel. The range of a fast carrier strike force was about 2,500 miles at steaming speed, at normal cruising speed. If, however, you have to do high-speed operations, you start consuming fuel at a much faster rate. Fast forward post-Pearl Harbor, the USS Lexington, CV-2, is sent on a mission to raid Wake Island. This is January of 1942. Lexington has the range to get to Lexington has the range to get to Wake Island and back, but there's no margin for error. So the key here is she's going to refuel en route to Wake Island and then on withdrawal from Wake Island from an oiler. And the oiler in this case is a ship called the USS Neches. The Neches is not a fast oiler. She was one of the smaller oilers, but she had the ability to do underway replenishment. And she sailed from Pearl Harbor to meet the Lexington. However, Neches ran afoul of the Japanese submarine I-72 and was sunk. And this convinced the Americans that in future operations, they had to defend their oilers. They couldn't send out high-value logistics vessels without an escort, something we have seen to lost, because what has been demonstrated by Bighorn coming out of operation is how vulnerable our logistics is. The other example we have of a true kind of full war scenario here was that story of the USS Neosho. Now, I love the story of Neosho because one of the first ships I sailed on was named for this vessel, the USNS Neosho. That is USS Neosho AO-23 backing out of Battleship Row just astern of the battleship California during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Neosho is one of a series of 12 fast oilers converted from commercial ships over to the U.S. Navy. 4 of them will be subsequently converted into escort carriers. 2 will operate in the Atlantic, but 6 of them, the 6 sister ships, will operate in the Pacific. They are the linchpin for U.S. fast carrier operations early in World War II. And it is in May of 1942 when the U.S. decides to send a strike group into the Coral Sea to thwart the Japanese offensive against Port Moresby and the landings at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. The carriers Lexington again and Yorktown this time are going to be supported by the fast oiler Neosho and a smaller oiler very much akin to Neches, a ship called the Tippecanoe. Tippecanoe is going to be the shuttle ship. It's going to move from Noumea, where there's a commercial tanker, out to refuel Neosho. Neosho will provide the fuel to both Lexington and Yorktown. Meanwhile, other fast oilers and other oilers are coming down from Pearl Harbor, along with reinforcements, the Enterprise and Hornet Strike Group, coming from the attack on Tokyo, the Doolittle raid. However, things run awry. The USS Neosho is attacked by the Japanese carrier strike group under Admiral Hara. This is the Shokaku and Zuikaku. They bomb the escort vessel of Neosho, USS Sims, sink it. Neosho gets bombed. It stays afloat for 4 days, eventually sinking on May 11th. And the Yorktown Lexington strike group find themselves without fuel. Now, that is not as critical an issue because Lexington gets sunk, and Lexington is the fuel hog of carriers. Her and Saratoga were just converted battle cruisers, and they sucked fuel like crazy. And so, Yorktown being damaged, the U.S. had to withdraw from the Coral Sea. However, prior to that operation, Admiral Nimitz and his staff at Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet had orchestrated a very elaborate logistics plan to keep fuel flowing into the region to support not just Yorktown and Lexington, but also Enterprise and Hornet. They could do it for a month, but after that they were going to run out of fuel. It's a beautiful symphony of movement of ships and cargo. Something that I worry that we can't do today. If you start talking about people looking at scenarios for a potential peer-on-peer confrontation, whether the U.S. versus China or Russia or even Iran, you have got to sustain a carrier strike group and other groups for protracted periods of time. That means not just carriers and air wings and cruisers and destroyers and submarines and all the other ancillaries you need. You need replenishment vessels. And the fact that Bighorn is taken out by a grounding demonstrates the vulnerability of logistics. And that is the point of raising this. And if anybody thinks it can't happen to them, they're dangerous. You have to be cognizant of the fact that there is always danger. You're going to run a ship, there's always a potential of an accident happening. And I'm not highlighting the accident on Bighorn. What I'm highlighting is the vulnerability of our logistics. Bighorn demonstrates to us that when you have one oiler sustaining a carrier strike group, that's the problem. And by the way, an unarmed oiler with a civilian crew on board, if I am planning how to interdict the U.S. military, that's what I'm looking for. Much like the Japanese did when they sank Neches in January of 1942 and Neosho in May of 1942. Let's be clear, Japanese didn't set out to do that. That was kind of accidental when they did it. However, what it did was demonstrated the logistic vulnerability of the United States. And it made the United States become much more logistically resolute and rounded them out so that they could suffer losses and sync it up so that when carrier strike groups later in the war go into combat, they have a depth of fuel and vessels. It is not really dependent on just a single ship or a single point of failure. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I know I didn't enjoy it because I feel for the crew on board USNS Bighorn. My thoughts are with all of you men and women on board the ship. You guys do yeoman work. You don't get the acknowledgement that you should. You're treated poorly, in my opinion, by the U.S. Navy. You need more leave. You need everything. My hearts are with you all the time. If you enjoyed today's episode, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly and yearly subscriber. For the people at MSC, don't get pissed at me. I'm not the one who causes this. I know you would much rather not this hit the news, and there's people who are going to sit there and scream that I'm violating operational security. But again, I didn't release this. I waited till the information was out there. But more importantly, when accidents happen, what you need to do is learn from them. And my fear is we're not learning from the accidents. I mean, the flashing lights are blinking. I got a big ass flashing light back here. I should have it blinking right now. Should be blinking red right there. That light should be blinking because there are concerns about our ability to maintain logistics. Back in the day, we had a fleet of oilers. You had USS oilers with Navy crews and weapons on board. They were backed by a fleet of USNS, MSC oilers that were running from port to port, bringing it up. And then behind them, I hadn't even talked about them, were commercial oilers, commercial tankers that were bringing fuel up to the forward bases and had the capability to do underway replenishment, to refuel those shuttle ships. We're starting to get that back. We're starting to bring vessels on. We've got a tanker security program that's got 10 tankers. However, we crippled the tanker security program when we don't allow those ships to be chartered by the government, by the Department of Defense, for more than 180 days. Got to fix that. Until our next episode, this is Sal. Frustratingly out.